She was serving tea in the garden when his eyes strayed from the newspaper. A second of hesitation, a touch that lasted longer than was acceptable, and his hand rested on hers, as if the world around her had disappeared. But the world was there, and so was she, watching. His wife, standing in the shade of the grapevine, holding her own ring as if she already knew. There were no screams, there was no scene, only silence, heavy, laden with a broken promise before the altar of routine. What was a secret became a sentence, and what was tenderness became a risk, because when a millionaire touches a maid with eyes of confession, the universe stops, but when his wife sees, the universe responds and exacts interest, with interest of the soul. After that afternoon, the garden was never the same. The flowers continued to bloom, the birds sang, dinner was served at 8 o'clock sharp. But something in the air had changed, a scent of betrayal that wouldn't dissipate, a creaking of doors that sounded like lament. The millionaire pretended not to remember, the maid tried to forget, and the wife smiled too much. But destiny doesn't erase itself with silence. It records, it observes, and then it returns, just when arrogance thinks it has escaped. In that mansion, the wind began to blow differently. The morning breeze brought back memories no one wanted to face, and Karma, silent, was already walking the halls, with satin shoes and unforgiving eyes. If this has kept you hooked this far, just imagine what's next. Like and subscribe. You'll understand why. The house was white, but it didn't seem pristine, with wide windows, marble columns, and too much silence for so much life hidden within. Located on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, it sat on an impeccable lawn surrounded by a hedge that hid rather than protected. There lived Mr. Raymond Blake, an investment banker, heir to a fortune he never needed to build. Tall, with a calm voice, cold eyes, always with an ironed suit and a glass of whiskey before 6. His wife, Eleanor, was the picture of static elegance, hair pinned perfectly, books in French on the bedside table, and a deep faith in the rituals of appearance. And between them, discreetly like a trained shadow, lived Myra, young from rural Texas, orphaned since 12, with brown eyes that knew how to observe the world without the world noticing. She was the maid, but not like the others. Myra had arrived 2 years earlier, recommended by Eleanor's distant aunt. Quiet, obedient, too intelligent for the position, but humble enough not to arouse suspicion. She could fold sheets with military precision and make Eleanor's green tea without her having to ask. She knew where the old love letters hidden on the bookshelf were, and that Raymond was allergic to cinnamon, though he never mentioned it. She was observant, and that was her greatest strength and her greatest danger. The routine in that house seemed written by an author who loved reruns. Coffee at 8. A garden pruned on Wednesdays, piano on Fridays with Eleanor practicing sonatas for no one to hear. On Sundays, Raymond would disappear for hours and return smelling of cigars and with his ties out of place. But Myra didn't ask. She never asked. It was as if I already knew that too many questions break the veil of comfort, and in that mansion, comfort was more valuable than truth. It was a Tuesday morning when the rhythm subtly changed. There was no thunder, no cup falling to the ground, no curtain fluttering in a prophetic wind, just a gesture. Eleanor asked Myra to serve tea in the garden. The sun was gentle, the birds exaggeratedly happy. Raymond was reading the newspaper, and then, as he handed her the cup, Myra's hand brushed against his. By accident, perhaps, or not, but what matters isn't the contact, it's the lingering separation. And he lingered. He held on. For a second longer than he should have. She felt it. He felt it too. And Eleanor was there, under the shade of the vine standing, her eyes fixed on the touch that shouldn't have been there. That moment wasn't marked by words, but by a silence that carried more weight than any scream, the kind of silence that only exists when something begins or ends. And there, without anyone knowing it yet, the story of 3 hearts began to change, like a mirror starting to crack from the inside, invisible at first glance, but inevitable. Eleanor didn't ask anything that day. She didn't change her tone, didn't exchange her usual dress for something darker, nor did she postpone dinner. She just looked. And that was enough. There was something in her eyes that didn't tremble. An ancient coldness, cultivated through years of appearances and tea served at the right time. It was the look of someone who didn't need to confront, just register, because she knew that time would restore everything that silence holds, and she knew how to wait. In the days that followed, routine seemed to have returned to normal. But nothing was the same. Mayra began to walk more slowly, as if her steps could be judged. She avoided the garden, looked away when delivering clean towels, and began locking her room at night, a habit she'd never had before. Raymond, for his part, seemed uncomfortably calm. His silence was like a locked room. You couldn't hear anything, but you could feel everything. He spent more time in the library, drank less, and every time he passed Mayra in the hallway, there was something in his eyes that wasn't guilt. It was suppressed desire. But the kind of desire you already know is costly. Eleanor was still smiling. Whenever Mayra served the table, she would say, "A thank you, dear, so sweet it hurt." She would run her fingers lightly around the rim of her wineglass, as if counting time. Sometimes I would watch Raymond as he read, not with jealousy, but with a calm curiosity, as if analyzing an animal about to reveal itself. And one Friday afternoon, while Eleanor watered the plants, in the orchid garden, she whispered something that pierced Mayra's heart like a razor. Flowers only survive because they know when to be silent. The maid didn't answer, but she felt it. It was a warning, a sign. And that night, for the first time, she dreamed of her mother. She hadn't seen her in years, not even in her dreams. But there she was, sitting in the field, looking up at the sky, saying, "Mayra, sometimes what seems like an opportunity is just a well-laid trap." She woke sweating, with the sheet wrapped around her feet. And she decided to avoid Raymond. He tried. For days he dodged. He switched shifts with the cook, asked to clean the east wing of the house, even avoided passing by the greenhouse where he usually smoked in the afternoons. But it was no use. Raymond began showing up in places he hadn't before, in the laundry room, in the pantry, in the hallway early in the morning, always with some excuse, and with his eyes heavy with that same pause in the garden. Eleanor knew, she felt it, but she didn't stop it. Because she didn't need to stop the inevitable, she just needed to watch. It was like a dance of mirrors, where Mayra's every move revealed more than it hid. And Raymond's every step was less a step toward temptation and more a step away from himself. It was in that interval between the gesture and the fall that fate began to sharpen its knives. And although no one there said it out loud, everyone knew. The next touch would not go unnoticed. The garden, so silent, was already preparing its witnesses. And karma, it doesn't warn. It just watches, waiting for the exact moment when the heart beats faster than reason can control. On the morning everything repeated itself. The sun seemed clearer. It was spring, and the flowers in the garden were blooming as if time had no fault in them. The grass had been cut the day before, and still held the damp scent of early spring. Eleanor asked for tea to be served outside again, just like last time. Raymond was already there, the newspaper folded in his lap, a vacant look lost in the shadows of the trees. Mayra hesitated. The tray in her hands trembled slightly, but she hid it with a deep breath. She descended the 3 steps of the porch, as if walking into a memory that still hurts. And as she approached, fate, which until then had walked alongside, began to walk ahead. This time, there was no bump, no accident, no excuse. Raymond simply looked up, took the cup, and, as he thanked her, took her hand again, firmly, with intention. His fingers touched her skin as if asserting a choice or challenging a limit. Mayra froze. Inside, a whirlwind. Outside, the same calm face she had learned to wear since childhood, when she understood that the world either devours you or domesticates you. She wanted to retreat, but she didn't. And in that split second, when time seemed to stop just for the two of them, the world, the real world, watched them, and it wouldn't forgive. At the upstairs window behind a sheer curtain, Eleanor watched, motionless. Her hands clasped, her breath held, her face expressionless, as if she'd been there for hours, waiting for this exact moment. Because now it wasn't intuition anymore. It was confirmation. And for her, that was enough. She wouldn't fight. She wouldn't scream, much less confront. She was made of a different kind of fury, one that doesn't need to display itself to destroy. After that touch, the day continued like a wounded animal, feigning normalcy. Mayra spent the rest of the morning reorganizing books that didn't need organizing. Raymond locked himself in his office and didn't even come out for lunch. Eleanor painted her nails dark red for the first time in years, and the silence between the three of them was different, denser, sharper. Something had broken there, and none of them knew exactly what, only that, where there had once been ground, there was now a crack. That night, while cleaning the silverware, Mayra noticed one of them was missing, the oldest, the one Eleanor used for special occasion dinners. She searched everywhere, until she found it in the sideboard drawer, next to an unlit candle and a handwritten piece of paper. All that is born of desire dies in regret. The handwriting was familiar, but not hers. She tucked the paper into her apron pocket and went upstairs to her room, her eyes throbbing. She slept little. She dreamed of the house on fire, but there was no smoke, only heat, and a distant laughter. For the first time, she was afraid not of what she felt, but of what she might become. The next day, the bracelet would be gone, and nothing would be the same. The day dawned with the house colder than usual, even with the typical spring warmth filtering through the tall windows of the mansion. Mayra woke with a strange sensation, as if something had moved, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Going downstairs, she noticed that Eleanor was already in the kitchen. Unusual. The millionaire's wife rarely set foot in that room before 9. She was standing next to the china cabinet, staring at a fixed point on the floor. She didn't even look up when Mayra entered. She simply said, her voice too calm, "I lost my bracelet." Mayra stopped. Her blood ran cold in her fingertips. That bracelet wasn't just any bracelet. It was a family heirloom, with white gold details and blue sapphires. Eleanor wore it only on special occasions, or when she wanted to be noticed. Now it was missing, and the way she announced the loss didn't sound like a warning, but like a test. Mayra tried to maintain control, offering to help her search, suggesting places, opening drawers, but Eleanor rejected every suggestion with the same sharp calm of someone who already knew the outcome of the story. "Sometimes what disappears doesn't want to be found," she said, before leaving the kitchen, leaving a scent of lavender and judgment in the air. Throughout the day, the search for the bracelet became the backdrop for a tension that spread like spilled ink on linen. The bracelet could have been anywhere, but everyone knew where the suspicion lay. Raymond didn't mention it. He didn't even seem surprised. He continued with his paperwork, his routine of silence, and his elegant escape from responsibility. Only late in the afternoon did he call Mayra into his office and say, without looking her in the eye, "If you need anything, you can come to me." But it wasn't an offer of help. It was a reminder that if she fell, she wouldn't fall alone. Mayra left with her stomach in knots. She didn't cry, she didn't respond. But as she passed the hallway mirror, she stopped. She looked at herself completely. And for the first time, she saw a woman who was beginning to lose her name. She was no longer just the maid. She was the center of a narrative she hadn't written, and yet she felt guilty for every comma. That night, the house ate dinner in silence. The table was set, perfectly as always. Eleanor wore a dark blue dress, her hair tied in a low bun. Raymond cut the meat with meticulous movements. Mayra poured the wine with hands that were already trembling inside. And between courses, Eleanor said with practiced ease, "It's funny how certain things disappear when we feel too much." And then she smiled, a smile that seemed to have invisible teeth. Hours later, while clearing away the dishes, Mayra noticed something in the living room. A picture frame had been turned over on the fireplace. She turned it over. It was an old photo, Eleanor and Raymond, younger, smiling in Paris. But in the reflection of the glass behind her, he saw something strange, a shadow standing in the hallway. When he turned, there was no one. But the mirror showed what the world dared not. And in that reflection, Mayra understood. What had disappeared from that house wasn't a jewel. It was trust. And everything that disappears with silence returns with noise. The next day there was a box on Mayra's bed. Small, square, wrapped in grey paper with a thin gold satin bow. No letter, no note, nothing but the weight of mystery. She looked around, but the door was locked, as she always did before bed. The window, too. It was impossible to know how it had gotten there. For a moment she hesitated to touch it, as if something inside her knew that certain gifts aren't given, they're planted. Still, she opened it, and inside lay a jewel. Not the missing bracelet. Another piece, a necklace. Discreet, elegant, with a pendant that imitated a bay leaf. It was expensive. She knew. And when she touched it, she felt the metallic taste of the trap. At the bottom of the box, a single sentence on thin paper. So you may remember that there is beauty in what is cultivated in silence. The handwriting was Raymond's. No signature, no address, but enough to transform the necklace into a golden handcuff. She hid the gift. He buried the box deep in one of the linen drawers. Not because he wanted to protect it, but because he feared what it would mean to leave it in plain sight. Mayra knew nothing came without a price in that house, and that necklace wasn't a gift. It was a reminder, a demand disguised as affection. Eleanor later seemed to notice something. While drinking tea on the veranda, she looked at Mayra with deafening calm. She simply said, "The most dangerous gifts are those that come without occasion." Then she turned her eyes to the horizon, like someone watching a ship drift away, knowing it will never return the same. Mayra remained silent. On the outside, she was still the obedient maid, but inside, a new feeling was creeping in. Anger. Not at Raymond, not at Eleanor, but at herself, for having allowed herself to be drawn into a script she didn't write, for not having fled at the first touch, for having believed that maybe, just maybe, he would see her differently. At dinner that night, Raymond touched her arm again, lightly, as if testing boundaries, as if to say, "You're mine." Eleanor this time didn't look. She simply wiped her lips with her napkin and got up from the table. Before leaving, however, she stopped behind Mayra's chair and whispered, "You'll need sturdy shoes to walk on broken stones." The phrase echoed in Mayra's mind all night. She slept little. She woke before sunrise. She walked to the garden and sat on the stone bench beneath the fig tree. It was the only place where she felt she could breathe. Without being judged, she touched the necklace hidden in her apron pocket. And there alone she understood that gift wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the sign that something had ended, perhaps her innocence, perhaps her hope, perhaps freedom itself. That same morning Eleanor called a jeweler. She asked to have an antique bracelet remade, as if she'd just found it. And while the man on the other end talked about deadlines and budgets, she replied, looking into the living room mirror, "Money doesn't cure betrayal, but it makes the scar more beautiful." The next night the house was filled with a strange smell. It wasn't coming from the kitchen or the gardens. It was incense, but not just any incense. A dense, heavy aroma of myrrh mixed with sandalwood. Mayra recognized it from afar. Her grandmother used to burn that same scent in times of mourning. When someone in the family was about to die, she would say, "The spirit feels it first, and the air warns later." Following the sweet and bitter trail, Mayra came face to face with Eleanor, kneeling before a small makeshift altar in the attic. There were 3 lit candles, a statue of St. Martha, and on the low table, a photograph that Mayra couldn't quite see. He only recognized his own hair. She paused at the door, unsure whether to enter or retreat. But Eleanor, without even turning her head, spoke, "You're already here. The silence has already been broken." Her voice was calm, more so than it should have been. There was no anger. There was no rush. There was a kind of gentle devotion, like someone who has spoken with pain long enough to understand it. "I'm not praying against you," Eleanor continued, still not moving. "I'm asking for everything to return to its right place." Mayra felt her throat close up. She wanted to answer, but no words came. He turned and walked down the stairs, as if each step weighed a ton. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to understand when. His life had become a piece in a ritual of silent power. He knew Eleanor was no ordinary woman. She knew it wasn't just a marriage in crisis or a distracted husband. There was something more, a code, an invisible order that kept things in place until someone, in this case her, crossed the line. And the line had been crossed. In the following days, the house grew quieter than usual. Raymond began leaving earlier and returning later. His face was weary, as if he were beginning to realize that yesterday's choices are today's bars. Eleanor, for her part, dressed more elegantly than usual. Jewelry, perfume, silk clothes, but it was as if each adornment was a warning. "I have not been defeated." Mayra felt the pressure of the atmosphere tightening her lungs, as if the air inside the mansion had been trained to suffocate anyone who dared to feel too much. One Monday afternoon, Eleanor called Mayra into the garden. She asked her to help her water the plants. Something simple, domestic, almost maternal. But as she passed the hose from hand to hand, she said, "Do you know why the most beautiful roses grow here? Because I talk to them, I tell them secrets, and they learn that silence protects." And then, with a quick gesture, she opened the bud of a rose yet to bloom. Inside, a dead insect, dry, small, but there, dying in beauty. Mayra got the message. Some things look like flowers, but they carry death inside. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to pretend to be a thorn. That night before bed, Eleanor lit the incense again. And as the scent filled the entire house, Raymond had a nightmare. He woke screaming, sweating. He spoke incoherently, but one phrase kept repeating itself. She was in the mirror. She saw everything. She knows. And no one asked who she was, because everyone knew. The morning after the nightmare, Raymond came downstairs with sunken eyes, unshaven, and a mood buried by something he couldn't name. He sat at the breakfast table as if merely performing an empty ritual. Mayra, as she served him, noticed he wasn't looking at her. For the first time in weeks he avoided contact, but the silence between them was louder than any words they could have uttered. Eleanor, impeccable as always, kept her smile discreet and the porcelain cup firmly in her hands. He didn't mention the early morning scream, nor the fact that Raymond, in his sleep, had called the maid's name. He simply said, "Dreams are the unconscious's most honest way of warning us that we've crossed a line," and then he sipped his tea, as if sealing an invisible pact with each sip. Mayra felt something had changed. It wasn't just the dream. It was the way the objects in the house seemed to be watching her now. The paintings seemed to hang at different angles. The living room clock slipped 3 minutes late every morning, as if time refused to obey. The stairs creaked on the once silent steps, and on the powder room mirror there was a stain that wouldn't disappear even after being scrubbed. A shadow, a sort of outline. No one talked about it, but everyone felt it. That afternoon, while cleaning the hallway leading to Raymond's office, Mayra heard a strange sound coming from inside, like someone crying. But it wasn't an ordinary cry. It was dry, muffled, as if someone were trying to swallow the pain in pieces. When she touched the doorknob, she heard the click of a lock, and then silence. A silence that said, "Don't come in. It's too late." She backed away. She returned to her work, but the sound stuck inside her, like an echo reverberating where words can't reach. That night, Eleanor turned on all the lights in the house. She said she felt like driving away the shadows. She ordered the windows opened, even with the icy wind. She put on a vinyl record, an old waltz full of melancholy, and she called Mayra to help her reorganize the books in the office. There, while they were sorting through editions that had never been read, Eleanor pulled an envelope from between the pages of a volume of French poetry. She handed it to the maid. "I found this. Maybe you'd like to keep it." Mayra opened it. It was an old photograph. She, Raymond and Eleanor, the three of them together at an event in the city months ago. But in the background of the image, almost imperceptible, was a figure reflected in the living room mirror. A woman. Her eyes stared straight into the camera, and the face was identical to Mayra's grandmother's. But she had been dead for years. The photo slipped from her hands. Eleanor, in a low voice, asked, "Do you believe the dead protect the living?" Mayra didn't answer, but in that moment she understood. What was happening here wasn't just an emotional struggle. It was an ancient reckoning, something older than them, and now taking its toll. In the early hours of the morning, Mayra went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. As she passed through the hallway, she saw Eleanor standing in front of the mirror in the entryway, alone, dressed in white, whispering something. When she realized she was being watched, she slowly turned and said, "The mirror only gives back what it's given. Be careful what you give it." Mayra couldn't sleep that night. The next day, Raymond didn't show up for breakfast, and for the first time in months, Eleanor cut a rose with her own hands. But not for decoration. She let it dry, petal by petal, on Mayra's grandmother's old diary. A diary Mayra never knew was in that house. And what was written there could not yet be read. The diary lay on the music room desk, exactly where Mayra would never have thought to look for it. The cover was aged leather, with marks that time had shaped like wrinkles on the skin of someone who had lived too long. In the bottom corner, hand-embroidered, was the name Irene V., the name of the grandmother who had raised her amid prayers and silence. Mayra approached it as if touching a still vivid memory. She opened it. Carefully, inhaling the ancient scent of paper and condensed time. The first pages were prayers, verses, accounts of a woman who had never been heard by anyone except the walls. But further on, the handwriting changed. It became more urgent, confessional. And there, hidden among the laments and whispers, was Raymond's name. Mayra stepped back, returned to the beginning, read it again. The same name, the same city, the same family. Her grandmother had been a maid in Raymond's mother's house. Decades ago, young, humble, silent, and deep within the pages, she described something that repeated itself with a cruel echo. "He looked at me as if I were invisible, but he touched me as if I belonged to him." Mayra felt her stomach churn, the blood pound in her temples. The story she was living now wasn't new. It was a cycle, a karma, an ancient script that rewrote itself using new skins and old intentions. The millionaire hadn't simply fallen in love with a maid. He was repeating, unconsciously or not, the same ancestral line of power, desire, and oblivion, as if the past had taught her nothing, as if error were hereditary. When Eleanor found Mayra with the diary in her hands, she said nothing. She simply leaned against the doorframe and watched. After a few seconds, she said, "I knew you'd find it someday. The walls of this house don't hide everything. Some things they reveal." And then, moving closer, she added, in a tone that mingled regret and triumph, "You're not the first, but you might be the last." Mayra slammed the diary shut. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to feel sorry for herself. She wanted to understand. Eleanor then revealed that she had found the notebook years ago, during one of the many silent renovations in the house. She read everything. She knew everything. And she chose silence, not out of fear, but as a strategy, because according to her, forgiveness offered too soon nullifies the learning. Raymond always believed that women's silence was a free space for their actions. I chose not to scream, I chose to wait. The lump in Mayra's throat turned to rage, but not blind rage. It was a new strength, shaped by generations of invisible women who whispered between the lines of a forgotten diary. The house wasn't just the stage for a forbidden passion, it was the tomb of stories never avenged. And now Mayra was the link between what was and what could still be repaired. That night, she took the necklace from her pocket and placed it on the living room table. Beside it, she left her diary open to the page where Raymond's name repeated, not as a memory, but as a debt. Eleanor, finding the necklace there, simply smiled, a slow smile, like someone seeing the wheel of time turn justly for the first time. The next day, the piano played by itself. None of the three were in the room. None confessed, none explained, but they all heard. And for the first time, they heard it together. That morning, the sound of the piano still seemed alive in the air. No one dared mention what had happened, but the fact that they didn't speak only made everything more intense. Eleanor walked through the hallways as if hearing footsteps where no one was present. Raymond seemed smaller, more hunched, as if something was pressing down on him from the inside out. And Mera, she was no longer the same. She didn't walk hurriedly, but with precision, like someone walking on territory that now belongs to her. The diary had been kept, not as evidence but as a relic. She read it again every night, memorizing passages, understanding not only her grandmother's story, but the story of all the women erased by repeated gestures and apologies disguised as affection. One grey afternoon, Eleanor hosted a tea party with two old friends, ladies of local high society. One of them had even once commented that Mera was too pretty to be just a servant, and on that occasion, Eleanor made her repeat the comment out loud, in front of Mera herself. Afterwards, she poured more tea as if nothing had happened, but now something had changed. During the gathering, Raymond appeared. It wasn't usual. She always avoided this kind of event. But he entered the room, looked directly at Mera, and remained there for several seconds. The atmosphere froze. Her friends noticed. Eleanor did too. And then, with a gesture no one expected, she stood up, went to her husband and said, "You're sweating. You should go upstairs and take a shower." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Raymond obeyed. Hours later, Eleanor called Mera into her room. She was sitting in front of the mirror, combing her hair with gentle strokes. She offered the maid some hand cream, and as she accepted, she said in a low but firm voice, "You think this is all about desire, Mera, but it's not. It's about position. Who serves and who is served, who looks and who is looked at, who has their name on the house documents and who passes unnoticed. He doesn't love. He repeats it, like a mistake he never had the courage to regret." Mera listened. She held every word. But she didn't react, because inside her, something stronger was growing. It wasn't a desire for revenge. It was a thirst for silent justice. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that reveals, the kind that exposes, the kind that forces the guilty to look at themselves until they can no longer bear their own shadow. The following night, Raymond called Mera into his office. He had a half-empty bottle of wine, his eyes bloodshot, and his gaze lost in the darkness. He said he wanted to talk. He asked for forgiveness. He said he had confused affection with neediness, attention with attraction, absence with openness. He cried. He begged her to listen, to understand, to stay. And as he spoke, Mera saw not a man in love, but a fragile man, an heir to emotional addictions, a repeater of words he had learned to use to avoid facing his own emptiness. She stood up. She simply said, "What you call love smells of repetition." And she left, unhurriedly, unafraid. In the hallway, he passed Eleanor. They didn't exchange a word, just a glance. But there, in that moment, two women stopped being adversaries and became part of a common agreement, an agreement with history, with time, with everything that had been buried in silence and now demanded a name. That morning, a door opened by itself. The wind carried away the last petal of the dried rose Eleanor had left on the diary. And no one spoke of the lost bracelet again, because everyone knew what was stolen had already been returned, with weight, with a mirror, and with silence. The next day, the house routine seemed meticulously normal. Coffee was served at the same time, the cutlery was lined up as always, and the staff's footsteps sounded restrained, measured, as if they were all walking on sacred and fragile ground. But something new hung in the air, an anticipation, like when nature holds back the wind before a storm. Mera woke with a strange premonition. Upon opening the bedroom door, she found a manila envelope on the floor with no return address. Inside, a note in letters cut from newspaper. The past does not forget, nor does it forgive. Nothing else. No symbol, no signature. But the message was clear. Someone else knew. She descended the stairs with the note hidden between the pages of her grandmother's diary. Deep down, she was no longer surprised. The house seemed to be made of invisible wiretaps, as if everything were being watched by a time older than the clocks. And somehow, the story Mayra believed to be hers now revealed itself to have more voices, more eyes, more echoes than she could bear. During lunch, Raymond remained silent. With each bite, he glanced around as if searching for a threat in the detail of the curtain, the position of the paintings, the faint sound of the wind blowing on the porch. Eleanor, on the other hand, spoke. She spoke of old parties, of forgotten books, of details of a life he no longer seemed to recognize. "Do you remember when we went to that house in the countryside?" she asked, her eyes fixed on his. Raymond frowned. "What house?" "The one where your mother hid the maid for 3 months after the scandal." The fork fell from his hand. The new maid stopped at the back of the room. Mayra froze. Eleanor didn't smile, didn't scream, just wiped her lips with the linen napkin and said, "I remember everything. I just thought you did too." Raymond stood up slowly, excused himself and left, as if the air in the room was poisoned. That afternoon, the glass greenhouse at the back of the property was hit by a sudden gale. None of the other rooms in the house were affected. Only there. Plants were scattered, pots were shattered, and among the shards a small trunk was found buried under the base of the wooden bench. Mayra was present when the gardener unearthed it. Inside were old letters, from Irene, from her grandmother, written to a woman named E, cursive, aged paper, dark ink. Some were of love, others of despair. One in particular said, "If he repeats to me what he did to your sister, may the mirror take him whole." Mayra took the letters to Eleanor. They sat in silence for minutes, side by side, without needing to say anything. There, before the evidence, the words "rescued from the earth and time" was confirmation that the cycle not only existed, it had been foreseen, denounced, warned, and ignored. The mirror, the same one that from the beginning seemed to be present in every important scene, now took on a new role. It was no longer a witness. It was a sentence. And at night, when Raymond passed by, the glass didn't reflect his face, only that of a woman who wasn't there. The living room was lit only by an antique lampshade, its fabric yellowed and edges stained with age. Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, her hands folded in her lap, dressed as if expecting guests to a private funeral. Mayra stood, leaning against the doorframe, holding one of her grandmother's letters, her fingers trembling slightly. Outside, a cold breeze ruffled the curtains. And then Raymond entered. Slowly, like someone who already knows they won't be greeted with applause or forgiveness. He looked at the two women, and then stood there motionless. There was no courage in his eyes, only weariness. The weight of his own shadow seemed to have buckled his shoulders. Eleanor, her voice low, said, "We need to talk, now." Raymond didn't answer. He sat down slowly on the leather sofa, ran his hand through his hair, and with a sigh said, "I was weak. To everyone. To my mother. To you. To her. To history. To myself." Mayra didn't move. The letter was still between her fingers, like a blade made of old words. Eleanor crossed her legs. She was serene, but not cold. There was an old, but now purified pain in her, like wine that had soured until it became elegant. "You were more than weak, Raymond. You were predictable. You repeated yourself, as if the mistake had no face, no memory, as if the women around you were just variations of a guilt you never wanted to see." He lowered his head. Mayra then approached and held out the letter. Raymond took it with trembling hands. He read it in silence, every line, every word, until his eyes welled up. But he didn't cry. He simply whispered, "I didn't know." Eleanor interrupted. "Yes, I knew. I always knew. The blood knows. The name knows. The mirror. Her knows. You just chose not to see. Because seeing is obligatory, and you never tolerated being forced into anything." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was dense, full of everything that had never been said in that house, but had always been there. Mayra took a deep breath. She knew that moment was the crossroads, the choice between remaining a victim of an inherited script or breaking away, even if it meant breaking away from everything. She looked at Raymond. She simply said, "As my grandmother died without justice. My mother lived in fear, and I was almost you, but I won't be." And he left the room. Raymond called out to her, but his voice was faint, like someone hailing a moving train. Eleanor didn't stand. She simply said, looking at the wineglass on the table, "I'll stay, but not for you. For me. To make sure this ends here, that this house doesn't feed on anyone else." Raymond stared at her, uncomprehending, but she didn't explain. Because some truths don't need words, they need consequences. That night, the mirror in the entryway shattered on its own, without a touch, without wind, for no apparent reason. Mayra heard the sound as she closed the back gate. Eleanor, picking up the shards, cut her finger. A drop of blood fell to the ground, and for a moment she smiled, because she knew the cycle had been wounded, and it was starting to bleed. The invitation was delivered with gold seal, perfect calligraphy, and thick paper. A charity event, hosted by Eleanor, to raise funds for a cause no one would later remember, but everyone in society would attend. Because in that town, certain invitations are not to be accepted. They are not to be refused. Mayra found it on the laundry room dresser, with her name handwritten on it. Eleanor wanted her to be there, not as an employee, but as a guest. In the bedroom, on the bed, lay a dress, gold, shiny, long, and new. No tag, no receipt, just the impeccable fabric and a simple note. "Today, silence is dressed in gold." Mayra hesitated. She considered refusing, but something inside her, stronger than fear, older than pain, pushed her. It was time to enter that house through the front door, to be seen, not as a shadow, but as a presence. When she came down the stairs hours later, everyone stopped. The party was packed. The sounds of fake laughter and clinking bowls filled the room. But Mayra, in that golden dress, seemed to shift the room's axis, as if truth had descended upon the party dressed in beauty. Raymond, upon seeing her, couldn't hide his shock. Eleanor across the room raised her glass and toasted, with a look that wasn't irony, it was justice. The party continued. Speeches were made, smiles exchanged, political promises murmured between sips of champagne. But at the center of it all were the three of them, orbiting in silence, in a dance that no one else saw, but everyone felt. When Mayra approached Eleanor, the hostess handed her an antique brooch with an emerald in the center and said with the gentleness of someone offering a legacy, "Use this. So they know you didn't come from the kitchen. You came from history." Mayra pinned the brooch to her dress. She smiled, and for a second it seemed she carried on her chest not a jewel, but the memory of all the women who had been silenced before her. Around midnight, Raymond approached. He was shaken. The mixture of guilt, wine, and despair made him teeter between confession and temptation. He touched Mayra's arm. He asked to talk. He insisted. And she calmly looked him in the eye and said, "Here, everyone can see me, including the mirror." And he walked away. Just then, the porch light flickered. A gust of wind ripped through the room, knocking over glasses and papers. And for a few seconds, the music stopped. The DJ would later swear it wasn't a technical glitch, that it simply stopped. Everyone looked around, laughed nervously, and the party resumed as if nothing had happened. But all three knew it wasn't a coincidence. Mayra left before the end. He walked through the gate with his hair blowing in the wind and his shoes in his hand. He wasn't running away. He was saying goodbye to a house, to a story, to a cycle that refused to continue with her. Eleanor watched from the window. Raymond, sitting in the back, held an empty glass, and the mirror in the entryway showed only the living room. No reflection, because what had to be seen had already been revealed. The morning. After the party, the house was too empty. Not of furniture, not of voices, but of presence. Eleanor drank coffee alone, the newspaper open in front of her, without reading a line. The sun's rays streamed through the window, touching the cold kitchen floor as if searching for something that was no longer there. Raymond had left early without saying where he was going. He had only left a vague note about urgent commitments. But Eleanor didn't mind. She already knew. Sometimes fate just needs one last push, and she had already given it hers. Mayra didn't return that night, or the following nights. She left without her bags, without warning, without looking back. She simply left an envelope on her bedroom dresser with two things, the emerald brooch and a page torn from Irene's diary. On it, handwritten in faded ink, was a sentence: "Everything that repeats itself without cure becomes a curse." Eleanor read it and smiled, a smile that wasn't of relief, but of finality. The cycle had ended, not out of revenge, but out of conscience. That same week, the police were called to the property, not because of violence, not because of a disappearance, but because of a complaint. Documents were seized, accounts examined, contracts investigated. And when questioned, Raymond said nothing. He remained silent. A heavy silence, filled with decades of echoes. The press began to murmur, small notes in discreet newspaper columns. Former local businessman investigated for possible links to illicit inheritances. But no one delved deeper, because power still loomed large, but not for long. Eleanor, in response, called for an interview. Sitting before the cameras, she said a few words. What is not confronted contaminates, and what is contaminated demands purification. The history of my home was built on beauty and silence. I choose now to rebuild it with truth. That was enough. The next day, society columns removed Raymond's name from invitations. Partnerships were dissolved. The Blake surname, once associated with tradition, now carried a different flavor. The taste of something long shrouded in linen napkins and averted glances. Weeks later, a new employee was hired. Young, discreet, kind. But Eleanor treated her differently. With a different tone, with a different demeanor. She never again allowed any female presence in that house to be invisible. She began offering fair contracts, studying her employees' histories, ensuring each one had the autonomy to leave whenever they wanted. The mansion was still the same, but the atmosphere, not. After the investigation, Raymond moved to a smaller property outside the city. He lived alone. He avoided dinner parties. He declined invitations. Once, he was seen standing in front of an antique shop window. He was looking at a mirror, an old model with a cast-iron frame and polished glass. The salesman swore he stared at it, unblinking, as if expecting to see something other than his own face. After that, he was never seen. Downtown again. Mayra never contacted anyone again. But the town whispers stories. Some say she was seen elsewhere, teaching literature at a public school. Others claim she opened a small bookstore, selling tea and used books. Some say she adopted her grandmother's surname, Irene, and that in her window there's always a mirror, facing inward. Eleanor still lights a candle by the fireplace every Friday. She doesn't pray out loud, she just watches the flame. On one of these nights, she wrote in her own diary. She was the truest reflection this house ever had, and the mirror. Finally it broke. The last petal of the dried rose fell onto the white carpet. No wind blew, no window opened, but the gesture was clear. A cycle doesn't end with forgiveness. It ends with awareness. And sometimes the cruelest punishment isn't being punished. It's being forced to live with what one has built. Raymond, to this day, wakes up in the early hours of the morning, always at the same time, and he goes to the living room mirror. But he no longer looks for his own reflection. Look for what you missed when you still could.